I found that it's easier to record it in a video, and then I put it onto YouTube, and then I play the recording and take it for my podcast. Okay, he said to his servant to undo the sketching material, spread his cloak on the rock, and was already lost in his task as Lewis descended to the carriage. Madeira proved as trustworthy as his host had promised. Perhaps it was exceptionally quality which threw such a golden luster over the dinner, unless it were rather the conversation of the blue-eyed Englishman, which made Louis Racy, always a small drinker, feel that in his company every drop was nectar. When Louis joined his host, it had been with a secret hope of at last being able to talk, but when the evening was over and they cut it up to the small hours, he perceived that he had chiefly listened. Yet there had been no sense in suppression, thwarted vulnerability. He had been given all the openings he wanted. Only whatever he produced a little fact, it was instantly overflowed by the other's imagination, till it burned in like a dull pebble tossed into a rushing stream. I don't see that vision. For whatever Lewis said was seen by his companion from a new angle. Oh, I see. And suggested a new train of thought. Each commonplace item of experience became a many-faceted crystal flashing with unexpected fires. The young Englishman's mind moved in a world of association and reference far more richly peopled than Lewis's, but his eager communicativeness, his directness of speech and manner instantly opened its gates to the simpler youth. It was certainly not the Madeira which sped the hours and flooded them with magic, but the magic gave the Madeira excellence, reputed of its kind. As Lewis afterward learned, a taste no other vintage was to have for him. But we must meet again in Italy. There are many things there that I could perhaps help you see, the young Englishman declared, as they swore eternal friendship on the stars of the sleeping inn. End of chapter 4. It was a tiny Venetian church, no more than a chapel, that Louis Racy's eyes had been unsealed. In the dull-looking little church, not even mentioned in the guidebooks. But for his chance encounter with a young Englishman in the shadow of Mont Blanc, Louis would never have heard of the place. But then, what else that was worth knowing would he ever have heard it of, he wondered. He had stood a long time looking at the frescoes, but put off at first he could admit it now, by a certain stiffness in the attitudes of the people, by the childish elaboration of their dress, so different from the noble draperies which Sir Joshua Discourses on Art had taught him to admire. In the great painters, by the innocent expressive look in their young faces, for even the gray beards seemed young. And then suddenly his gaze had lit on one of those faces in particular, that the girl with round cheeks, high cheekbones, and widely set eyes under the intricate headdress of pearl-woven braids. Why, it was Tracy Kent to the life, and so far from being thought plain. The young lady who was no other than a peerless princess, about whom the tale revolved. And what a fairy land she lived in, full of lithe youth, well-rounded, round faces, pouting maidens, rosy old men, and burnished blackamoors, pretty birds, cats, nibbling rabbits, and all involved, enclosed in a golden balustra, in colonnades of pink and blue and laurel gardens festooned from ivory balconies and domes and minarets against summer seas. Louis' imagination lost itself in the scene. He forgot to regret the noble draperies, the exalted sentiments, the Fuliginous, Fuliginous, backgrounds of the artist. He had come to Italy to admire, forgotten, Sasso Ferrato, Guido Reni, Carlo Dole, Lo Spalletti, Carvacini, even Transfiguration of Raphael, though he knew it to be the greatest picture of the world. After that, he had seen almost everything else in Italy art had to offer. Had been to Florence and Naples and Rome, to Bologna to study electric school, to Parma to examine the Correggios, to Giorgio Romas. But that first vision had laid a magic seed between his lips, the seed that makes you hear what the birds say and the grasses whisper, even if his English friend had not continued at his side, pointing out, examining, inspiring. Louis Racy flattened himself that the round face of the little Saint Ursula would have led him safely and kindly past all her rivals. She had become his touchstone, his star. Empath. How insipid seemed to him all the sheep-faced versions, draped in red and blue and paint, after he had looked into her wondering girlish eyes and traced the elaborate pattern of her brocades. He could remember now quite distinctly the day when he had given up even Beatrice Cencia, and as for that fat, naked Magdalena of Caro Dulce, lolling over the book she had not read and ogling the suspector in the good old way. Faugh! Saint Ursula did not need to rescue him from her. His eyes had been opened to a new world of art. In this world, it was his mission to reveal to others. He, the insignificant, the ignorant Louis Racy, as but for the grace of God and that chance encounter at Mont Blanc, he might have gone on being to the end. He shuddered to think of the army of Napoleon beggar boys, bituminous monks, whirling prophets, languishing Madonnas, and pink-rumpled Moria, who might have been traveling home with him in the hold of a fast new steamer. His excitement had something of a pass of ecstasy. He had not only in a few hours to embrace Tracy and be reunited to his honored parents, and he was also to go forth and preach the new gospel to them that sat in the darkness of Salvatore Rouse and Los Spaghetto. The first that struck Louis was the smallness of the house of the sound and the largeness of Mr. Racy. He had expected to receive the opposite impression. In his recollection of varnished Tuscan villa, had retained something of the impressiveness, even when compared to the supposed originals. Perhaps the very contrast between their draughty distance and the naked floors and the expensive carpets and the bright fires of High Point, magnificent in memory of the latter. There were moments when the thought of his growing bored certainly added to the effect, but the image of Mr. Racy had meanwhile dwindled. Everything about him and his son looked back, seemed narrow, juvenile, almost childish. His bluster about Edgar Poe, for instance, drew poet still to Louis, though he had since heard richer notes. His fussy tyrant of his womankind, in his unconsciousness, but total ignorance of most of the things, books, people, ideas, that now filled his son's mind. Above all, the arrogance and the incompetence of his artistic judgment, beyond the narrow range of reading mostly, Louis suspected, called in drowsy after-dinner snatches from nights, half hours with the best authors. Mr. Racy made no pretense to book learning, left that as he handsomely said to the professors, but on matters of art he was dogmatic and explicit, prepared to justify his opinions by the citing of eminent authorities, of market prices quite clear, as his farewell talk with his son had shown, as to which old masters should be privileged to figure in the Ricey collection. The young man felt no impatience of these judgments. America was a long way from Europe, and it was many years since Mr. Ricey had traveled. He could hardly be blamed for not knowing the things he admired were no longer admirable. Still less for not knowing why the pictures before which Lewis had knelt in spirit had been virtually undiscovered, even by the art students and the critics in his father's youth. How was the American gentleman filled with his own self-importance and paying his courier the highest salary to show him the accredited masterpieces? How was he to guess that wherever he stood, wrapped before a Sofferrato or a Carlo Dolci, one of those unknown treasures looked more by under dust cobwebs? No, Lewis felt only tolerance and understanding. Such a view was not one to magnify the paternal image. But also the young man entered the study where Mr. Ricey sat immobilized by gout. The swathed legs stretched along his sofa seemed only another reason for indulgence. Perhaps Lewis thought afterward it was his father's prone position, the way his great bulk billowed over the sofa and the lame leg reached out like a mountain ridge, that made him suddenly seem to fill the room, or else the sound of his voice booming irritably across the threshold and scattering Mrs. Ricey and the girls with a fierce "And now, ladies, if the hugging and kissing is over, I should be glad of a moment with my son." But it was odd that, after mother and daughters had withdrawn, with all their hoops and flaunces and the study seemed to grow even smaller. Lewis himself to feel more like David without the peddler. "Well, my boy," his father cried, crimson and puffy, "here you are at home again, and many adventures to relate, no doubt, and a few masterpieces to show me, as I gather from the drafts on my exchequer." "Oh, as to the masterpiece, sir, certainly," Lewis simpered, wondering why his voice sounded so flaunty, and his smile was produced with such a conscious muscular effort. Good, Mr. Ricey approved, waving a violent hand which seemed to be ripening for a bandage. "Really carried out my orders, I presume. Saw to it that the paintings were disposed deposited with the bulk of your luggage in Canal Street. Oh, yes, sir. Mr. Reedy was on the dock with precise instructions, you know. He always carries out your orders, Lewis ventured with a faint irony. Mr. Reedy stared. Mr. Reedy, he said, does what I tell him, if that's what you mean. Otherwise, he would hardly have been in my employ for 30 years. Lewis was silent, and his father examined him crucially. You appear to have filled out your health is satisfactory. Well, Mr. Robert Hassad and his daughters are dining here this evening, by the way, and will no doubt be expecting to see the latest French novelties in stocks and waistcoats. Malvina has been a very elegant figure, your sister tells me. Mr. Reedy chuckled, and Lewis thought, I knew it was the oldest Hassan girl, while a slight chill ran through his mind. As to the pictures, Mr. Racine pursued, growing animation, I am laid low, and you see by this cursed affliction. Until the doctors get me up again, here must I lie and try to imagine how your treasures will look in the new gallery. And meanwhile, my dear boy, I need hardly say that no one is to be admitted to see them until they have been inspected by me and suitably hung. Reedy shall begin unpacking at once, and when we move to town next month, Mrs. Racy, God willing, shall give the handsomest evening party New York has ever seen, to show my son's collection and perhaps, to celebrate another interesting event in his history. Lewis met with his faint but respective gurgle, and before his blurred eyes rose and wistfully faced Tricia Kent. I shall see her tomorrow, he thought, taking heart against as soon as he was out of his father's presence. End of chapter 5.